Get away from my daughter!" The woman's voice sliced through the chaos like glass shattering marble. But when the man she accused reached for his wallet and revealed the badge inside, every single breath in the ballroom stopped cold. Before we dive into this story of judgment, justice, and redemption, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. The laughter drained from the air as though someone had pulled the plug from the night itself. Champagne flutes stopped halfway to painted lips. Violins screeched to a confused halt, and every head in the Harrington Estate ballroom turned toward the scene unfolding at the center of the marble floor. A little girl sat crying beside the dessert table, her white satin dress pulled around her like spilled milk, one shoe missing, curls tangled from a fall. Her small fingers were wrapped around the wrist of a man in a worn gray jacket, the kind that didn't belong in a place like this. Victoria Harrington's voice split the silence. "Get away from my daughter!" It wasn't just a command, it was a verdict. An execution wrapped in silk and fear. The orchestra stopped. The waiters froze. The man's head lifted slowly, revealing a face not shocked, not angry, but calm. Calm in a way that made people even more afraid. "I said get away!" she repeated, her heels clicking sharply as she rushed forward, diamonds flashing like warning lights. The man didn't move. He simply loosened his hand, letting the child's small fingers fall away. "She fell," he said quietly, voice low, steady. "I was helping her up." But in rooms like this, tone mattered less than tailoring, and Daniel Cole didn't look like anyone who belonged near a Harrington. The whispers came quick. Who is he? Is he staff? How did he even get in here? One guest pulled her husband closer. Another ushered her son behind her chair. Someone raised a phone, recording. Because that's what people did now. They didn't intervene, they documented. Victoria reached her daughter, dropping to her knees in a gown worth more than most people's cars. "It's okay, baby," she murmured. Though her eyes never left the man standing inches away, her daughter whimpered, confused, clutching her mother's sleeve. "He tried to help me," she whispered. But Victoria barely heard her. All she could see were Daniel's calloused hands, the scuffed boots, the quiet composure that felt too out of place, too deliberate. Security pushed through the crowd, black suits and earpieces slicing the sea of sequins. "Step back, sir," one barked. Daniel didn't. He stood there, shoulders squared but not tense, eyes level, unreadable. "Sir, I said, step—" He reached into his jacket. The entire room inhaled. Someone screamed. A waiter dropped a tray. Glass shattered across the floor like gunfire. "Don't move!" one guard shouted, drawing his weapon. Victoria clutched her daughter, heart pounding, breath coming fast. "Don't you dare," she hissed. Daniel paused. His gaze flicked toward the girl on the floor, wide-eyed, trembling, and then back to her mother. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled something from his inner pocket and held it where everyone could see. Not a gun, not a threat. A badge. FBI. The gold caught the light of the chandeliers, gleaming sharp and final. Silence, thick and absolute, filled the room. The guards froze mid-step. The woman nearest the stage lowered her phone, mouth open. Somewhere in the back, the violins gave a single confused note before dying again. Victoria stared, lips parted, words lost. Daniel's voice was calm, almost gentle. "No one is in danger." He tucked the badge back into his jacket like it wasn't something that could rearrange a room's heartbeat. "Your daughter tripped on the corner of the carpet. I was helping her before you saw." Victoria rose, slowly, still clutching her daughter. "You're an agent?" He nodded once, was trying to stay invisible. Guess that failed. Her eyes narrowed. "Invisible? Why would an FBI agent be here at my event, pretending to be staff?" Daniel didn't answer, not yet. He looked around the ballroom, at the glittering crowd, now pretending not to stare. His gaze landed briefly on a man at the far end of the room, sharp suit, easy smile, who had gone pale. Daniel's tone changed just slightly. "Because sometimes," he said, "the people who smile the widest have the most to hide." Victoria's pulse thundered in her ears. "What are you talking about?" But Daniel had already turned away, his expression unreadable, eyes following that pale man who was slowly, quietly slipping toward the exit doors. In the hush that followed, the chandeliers hummed faintly, the sound of wealth pretending nothing had happened. Victoria held her daughter tighter, torn between fury and unease. Somewhere deep down, she realized the look in Daniel's eyes wasn't the look of a trespasser. It was the look of a man who'd already seen too much. And though no one said it out loud, every person in that glittering room knew whatever had just happened was only the beginning. The gold of the badge shimmered beneath the fractured chandelier light, each reflection scattering across polished glass and stunned faces. It wasn't supposed to belong here, not in a ballroom stitched together by diamonds and lies. The guards, mid-step and mid-breath, froze like statues, unsure of their purpose. Victoria's face went through 3 expressions at once: shock, disbelief, and something colder, sharper, laced with the kind of fear only people who have everything to lose ever know. "You're not," she began, her voice breaking under the weight of a question she couldn't finish. "I'm Daniel Cole," he said, his tone steady but heavy with exhaustion. "Special Agent, Behavioral Crimes Division. Ma'am, your daughter isn't in danger." He paused, his eyes flicking toward her trembling hand, still clutching the child's shoulder. Then his voice lowered. "But you are." The words struck like a slow detonation. Murmurs rippled across the room, glasses clinking nervously, whispers cutting through silk and perfume. The DJ, pale and uncertain, turned off the music entirely. All that remained was the collective breath of 100 people who suddenly wished they hadn't come. Victoria blinked, her pulse hammering in her throat. "Excuse me?" she demanded, trying to rebuild her composure, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Who do you think—" Daniel pocketed the badge. "I didn't come here for you," he said quietly. "I came for the man standing behind you." The silence grew teeth. Heads turned, dresses rustled, and there, near the marble bar where the champagne tower glimmered like temptation, stood Ethan Carrington, Victoria's fiancé. Perfect hair, perfect suit, perfect smile. Except now that smile was gone. His complexion drained to a sickly shade of ivory. His fingers twitched, then dropped the half-filled glass he'd been holding. It shattered against the tile, the sound slicing through the room like a scream. "Ethan Carrington," Daniel said, voice like iron dipped in calm. "Sit down." For a moment no one moved. The air itself seemed to wait. Ethan's eyes darted toward the nearest exit, then toward Victoria. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice just slightly too high, his charm cracking under the strain. "What kind of stunt are you pulling?" "This isn't a stunt," Daniel replied. It's a warrant." Victoria turned to Ethan, confusion and dread fighting for space across her face. "A warrant?" she whispered. "For what?" Daniel took a step forward, his shoes echoing against the marble. "For embezzlement, fraud, and obstruction of justice." His tone didn't rise, but each word carried enough weight to sink the room. "But that's not the part you'll find most interesting." He stopped, meeting Ethan's eyes directly. "We believe you've been using the Harrington Foundation's charity accounts to move money for an international trafficking network." Gasps filled the air. One woman dropped her purse, another covered her mouth with shaking hands. Ethan barked out a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You can't be serious." This is absurd." "Victoria, tell him." But she couldn't. Her mind raced backward. Missed calls, unexplained trips, the sealed envelope she was told not to open. Every thread she'd ignored suddenly pulled tight. "Ethan," she whispered, "what did you do?" "I didn't—" he started, but Daniel's hand was already on the radio clipped beneath his jacket. "Unit 3, move in." His voice was calm, procedural. Within seconds, 2 plainclothes agents entered through the main doors. their presence quiet but undeniable. "Don't you touch me," Ethan snapped, backing away. "I want my lawyer." "I want—" "Lawyers don't do much good when there's evidence in the vault," Daniel interrupted. "You've had a good run, Mr. Carrington. But it ends tonight." Ethan's facade cracked completely. He lunged for the side exit, shoving past the crowd, but the agents were faster. A struggle, brief and brutal, followed by the metallic click of handcuffs and the sound of glass crunching beneath shoes. Victoria stood frozen, her daughter's small hand gripping her dress. The people around her didn't speak. They didn't dare. Their glittering evening had turned into something raw, real, and ugly. Daniel turned toward her one last time, eyes softened now, voice almost kind. "You should get your daughter somewhere safe," he said quietly. "There's more to this than you know." She stared at him, lips trembling. "Who are you?" He paused, glancing down at the floor where the champagne and glass had mixed into something that looked almost like blood. "Someone who's been waiting a long time for justice," he said. And with that, the ballroom erupted again. Not with music, not with laughter, but with the echo of a truth no one could unhear. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The chandelier light flickered off crystal and fear, and the air itself seemed to stop breathing. Ethan Carrington stood like a statue, his jaw tight, eyes darting between the exits and the faces staring at him. Then, like a wire snapping, he ran. The sound of his shoes slapping against the marble floor cut through the stunned silence. "Ethan!" Victoria's voice cracked through the room, sharp and disbelieving. She reached for him, but he was already gone, a blur of motion between tuxedos and gowns. The crowd erupted. Chairs toppled. Someone screamed. Glass shattered against tile. The glittering elegance of the gala folded into chaos. Daniel moved before thought could catch up. Training replaced hesitation. His stride was swift, precise, his voice cutting through the panic. "FBI! Everyone stay down!" His hand brushed the inside of his jacket, but he didn't need the gun. Not yet. Ethan reached the far end of the ballroom, shoved through a waiter, and slammed into a pillar that refused to move. In the next second, Daniel was there, fist gripping the man's collar, momentum forcing him forward. Ethan swung wildly, desperation turning polished charm into something feral. Daniel blocked it, pinned him against the marble, arm twisted, wrist locked. "You have the right to remain silent," he said, his voice low, measured, and calm. Too calm for a night like this. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words were practiced, mechanical, but beneath them ran a quiet edge of sorrow. Ethan struggled, breathing ragged, a small trickle of blood marking where his cheek had hit the pillar. "You don't understand," he gasped. "You have no idea—" Daniel tightened the cuffs. "I know enough." Security guards rushed in, hesitating at the sight of the badge glinting on Daniel's belt. "We've got it," one muttered, but Daniel didn't release him. "No," he said. "You'll keep this scene secure." Nobody leaves. At the other end of the room, Victoria stood frozen, one hand covering her mouth, the other gripping her daughter's shoulder like an anchor. Her voice trembled. "What is happening?" Daniel turned toward her, still holding Ethan in place. "He's been under investigation for 6 months," he said, "for laundering money through your charity network and for using children's foundations as cover operations for trafficking." The words landed like a physical blow. She swayed, her knees nearly buckling, eyes darting between Daniel and the man she thought she knew. "No," she whispered. "No, No, you're lying." Daniel's face softened, the steel in his voice giving way to something almost gentle. "I wish I was." Ethan's voice cracked with a desperate laugh. "You have no proof," he spat. "You can't prove anything." Daniel leaned close enough that only he could hear. "We already did." The quiet between them was deafening. Victoria's breathing came in shallow bursts. Every glance, every dinner, every whispered promise she'd believed suddenly felt like fiction. "Why would you even be here?" she demanded. her voice shaking with something between fury and grief. "How could you have known?" Daniel's gaze flicked down to the small girl clutching her mother's dress, eyes wide, face pale. His tone shifted again, quieter now, almost reverent. "Because your daughter sent us an anonymous letter." Victoria froze. "What?" Daniel nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. 3 weeks ago, we received a handwritten note, crayon on notebook paper. No return address, just one line. "Mom's boyfriend hides bad things in the red box under the piano." Her throat tightened. Her mind flashed back to Ava's bedtime story nights, to the drawings she never paid much attention to. "That's not possible," she whispered. She's only 7. Daniel looked at the child again. "Kids see more than we do, especially the things we refuse to." Ethan struggled against the cuffs, but it was pointless. The mask he'd worn for years, perfect fiancé, philanthropist, savior, was gone. What remained was hollow. Victoria sank to the floor, holding her daughter close, the world tilting out from under her. "You're saying my child?" She couldn't finish. Daniel crouched slightly, voice low and steady. "Your daughter told the truth when no one else dared to. She saved you before you even knew you needed saving." Ava's small hand slipped into her mother's, her voice trembling but clear. "I didn't want the bad man to hurt you, Mommy." Victoria broke then, not loudly, but in the quiet way people do when they finally see what love has been trying to tell them all along. Daniel rose, signaling to the agents waiting near the door. They moved Ethan toward the exit, flashes from cameras beginning again as the world outside started to feast on the story. He looked back once at the mother and daughter cradled in the ruin of their perfect night. Sometimes, he thought, justice didn't roar. Sometimes it came wrapped in crayon and innocence, and it always left the grown-ups learning too late how blind they'd been. The room seemed to tilt. The chandeliers above swayed ever so slightly, their reflections trembling across the marble floor as if even the light was holding its breath. Victoria couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her mind clung to one phrase that refused to make sense. "My daughter?" she repeated. "Babihi," her voice small, almost childlike. Daniel's expression didn't waver. 3 weeks ago," he said softly, "we received a handwritten note. Crayon handwriting, smudged fingerprints, no name, no return address." He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges wrinkled, faintly stained with what might have been tears or juice or both. He unfolded it carefully, like it was something sacred. "It said," he continued, "Mom's boyfriend hides things in the red box under the piano." A low hum rippled through the room. Conversations turned into murmurs, murmurs into disbelief. Victoria's eyes darted toward the corner of the hall, the grand piano, glossy and still gleaming from the night's earlier performances. And there, barely visible in the dim light beneath it, was something red. Daniel nodded to one of the officers. "There." The officer crouched, his gloved hand steady, and slid the box out. The metal scrape against marble echoed through the hall like a warning. The box wasn't big, but it was heavy. Its paint was chipped, a faint scratch running across the lid. Daniel motioned again, and the officer snapped open the small silver lock. The click was deafening. Inside was the kind of silence that doesn't come from lack of noise, but from too much truth landing at once. Stacks of cash, bundles thick with elastic bands, a pile of passports, all with Ethan Carrington's face but different names, a few driver's licenses, a collection of phones, and then Daniel froze. Photos, dozens of them. Some printed on cheap paper, others glossy, organized too carefully to be anything innocent. Children, faces blurred, dates written in the corners. Victoria covered her mouth, the sound that escaped her, not quite a scream, not quite a sob, just the sound of something breaking in half. Ethan's face drained of color, his body stiff as the cuffs bit into his wrists. "That's not mine," he said hoarsely. "This is some kind of setup." Daniel's voice cut through. We've heard that line 1,000 times. He took the folded paper from his hand and handed it gently to Victoria. This came from your daughter. Her trembling fingers unfolded it. There, in bright purple crayon, the words curved unevenly across the page. Mom's boyfriend hides things in the red box under the piano. The letters wobbled, some backward, some written over twice. At the bottom, a small smudge where a thumb had pressed too hard. Victoria stared. Her chest felt tight, her breaths shallow. She saw this? She saw more than she understood, Daniel said quietly. Kids notice the truth before adults do. The room had stopped moving. The guests, who moments ago were glittering spectators, now stood in the background like ghosts, afraid to breathe. Somewhere near the piano, one of the strings hummed faintly in the silence, a haunting note that hung between them. Victoria dropped into a nearby chair. Her hand shook so badly she nearly dropped the letter. She looked down at the handwriting again, her daughter's. The same hand that had written birthday cards, drawn rainbows, and doodled hearts. Now it had drawn the map to betrayal. From behind her, a small voice spoke. "Mommy?" Ava stood by the doorway, clutching the skirt of her white dress. Her curls framed her face, damp with tears. "I told you," she whispered, her voice quivering. "I told you he was scary." Victoria's eyes filled instantly. She reached out a trembling hand, but the weight of her guilt pressed harder than gravity itself. "And I told you," she whispered back, voice cracking, "to stop making stories." The little girl's lip trembled and she took a hesitant step forward. Daniel's gaze softened, his voice low, meant only for them. "She wasn't making stories," he said. "She was making a rescue." The truth of it cracked something open in Victoria, something she'd built for years out of denial, comfort, and the illusion of safety. The tears came quiet, without restraint, falling onto the paper still clutched in her hands. Around them, the hall that once glowed with elegance now felt suffocating, every mirror reflecting a version of herself she didn't recognize. Daniel turned to the officers. "Get the evidence logged. We're done here." Ethan muttered something under his breath. Please, curses, it didn't matter. The agents led him away, his polished shoes squeaking against marble like the sound of a crumbling life. Victoria held her daughter close, pressing her face into the child's hair, breathing in the scent of innocence she had almost lost. Daniel lingered for a moment watching them. His eyes, steady and distant, carried a kind of grief that didn't belong to this case alone. The letter slipped from Victoria's fingers, landing softly at his feet. The purple words stared up from the floor, uneven and bright against the marble, proof that even the smallest hands could uncover the darkest secrets. By dawn, the Harrington estate no longer belonged to Victoria. It belonged to the world. Helicopters hovered like vultures above the manicured lawns, their searchlights cutting through the early fog. Reporters crowded the iron gates, shouting her name through megaphones, camera flashes popping like gunfire. The headlines had already written her story before she could. Heiress's fiancé arrested at charity gala. Scandal rocks the Harrington Foundation. The life she had so carefully curated, pearls, pressed statements, pristine optics, was unraveling faster than she could breathe. Every phone on her desk lit up in unison. Calls from board members, publicists, lawyers. Messages piled in from people who used to greet her with warmth, now demanding distance, cloaked as advice. "You need to step back, Victoria. Let the storm pass." But she knew better. Storms didn't pass when you were standing at their center. She retreated into her study, the only room that still felt like hers. The heavy curtains were drawn shut, though camera lights still flickered faintly against the glass. Her hands trembled as she tried to pour herself a drink but stopped halfway, the amber liquid sloshing just shy of the crystal rim. She set it down and stared instead at the framed photos lining her desk. Ava at 4, missing teeth, smiling so wide it seemed like the sun had borrowed her face. There was one of Ethan, too. She turned it down slowly, unable to look at the lie any longer. Daniel stood in the doorway quiet. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. His presence carried its own gravity. "They won't stop for a while," he said. Victoria didn't look up. "Reporters never do," she murmured. "Not them," he said softly. "The truth." She exhaled, her voice barely holding. "How did you know? How long were you watching us?" Daniel stepped farther into the room, the weight of his boots pressing softly against the carpet. "You were already under watch," he admitted. "Your foundation had anomalies, funds that vanished between accounts, donations rerouted. We suspected Ethan was using your philanthropy network to move money offshore, but—" His tone changed, almost reverent. "We didn't expect your child to expose him first." That word, child, hit her harder than any headline. She sank back into her chair, eyes burning. "I thought I was protecting her," she said, her voice small, cracking in places she couldn't hide. "I kept her away from the world, from people, from everything ugly." Daniel leaned against the edge of the desk, folding his arms loosely. "Sometimes walls don't protect," he said after a pause. "They isolate. And isolation blinds you to what's already inside." The sentence settled like dust in the air. Victoria turned her head, finally meeting his gaze. She studied him for a long time, not as the man who had embarrassed her in front of the city, but as someone who carried something unseen, something heavy. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "Really?" He hesitated. Then his voice dropped, quieter than before, almost confessional. "A father," he said, "one who made the same mistake." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was understanding, the kind that recognizes itself in another person's grief. Daniel moved to the window and pulled the curtain slightly, revealing a swarm of flashing bulbs at the gates. "They'll tear you apart for a while," he said, watching the chaos unfold. "Then they'll move on to the next story." She looked down at her trembling hands. "And what about after?" He turned to her, his eyes soft but steady. "After is when you decide who you are without the applause." She blinked hard, trying to hold herself together. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," he said, "but it's possible." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the noise rose and fell in waves, the sound of curiosity masquerading as concern. Inside, only the faint hum of the old grandfather clock filled the air. Finally, Victoria spoke, her words fragile but sincere. "Do you have children?" Daniel's eyes flickered, a shadow passing over them. "Had," he corrected softly. "A daughter." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She didn't press. He wasn't ready, and she knew the sound of a wound when she heard one. When he finally turned to leave, she stopped him with a whisper. "Agent Cole." He paused at the doorway. "Thank you," she said, "for believing her when I didn't." He gave a faint nod, the kind of gesture that carried more emotion than words ever could. "Kids don't lie about monsters," he said quietly. "Adults just stop believing in them." When the door closed behind him, Victoria let her head fall into her hands. The flashes outside kept coming, relentless, but inside the study she finally cried, not as an heiress, not as a headline, but as a mother who had just learned what truth cost. By midnight, the estate had gone quiet. The reporters were gone, the flashing lights had dimmed, and the last patrol car rolled slowly down the driveway, its red and blue glow fading into the wet dark. Rain had begun to fall, not a storm, not the kind that demanded attention, but a soft, steady drizzle that seemed almost merciful. The ballroom that had once pulsed with life and laughter now sat hollow, its chandeliers dripping faint reflections onto the marble floor. Daniel sat alone on the back steps, his jacket darkened by the rain, the collar turned up but not enough to keep him dry. He didn't seem to care. His hands were clasped loosely, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the line where the estate's manicured gardens blurred into the forest beyond. Somewhere out there, frogs croaked low and steady, keeping rhythm with the rain. Victoria hesitated at the threshold before stepping outside. Her heels clicked against the stone for only a moment before she stopped, then slipped them off, carrying them in one hand. She approached quietly, her breath misting in the cool night air. "You said you were a father," she murmured. Daniel didn't turn right away. His gaze stayed on the horizon. "Was," he said finally, his voice quiet, but sure. "My daughter, Emily." She was 6. The words landed softly, like raindrops on water, but the ripples they left behind were endless. Victoria's heart clenched. What happened? He inhaled through his nose, the kind of breath people take when they've had years to prepare for the question, but it still cuts. "Car accident, he said. "Hit and run. She and my wife were walking home from the park. A drunk driver came around the corner too fast. He didn't stop. The car was found miles away, burned out. The driver was never caught." For a long time, only the rain answered. Victoria's voice, when it came, was small. "I'm sorry." Daniel nodded, still not looking at her. "Everyone says that," he murmured, "and they mean it." But it doesn't help. His tone wasn't cruel, just factual, like a man who had catalogued every stage of grief until it became muscle memory. "After it happened, I left the force. Couldn't stand the desk, the silence, the pity. Joined the bureau. Thought if I could find the man who killed her, I could breathe again." Victoria studied his profile, the set of his jaw, the faint scar near his temple, the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes. "Did you find him?" she asked quietly. Daniel's eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the rain turned everything silver. "No, but I found 1,000 others just like him, monsters who hide behind charm, behind power, behind good intentions, the kind that smile in pictures and ruin lives off camera." She sat beside him then, the cold stone seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. "And now you pose as a janitor?" That earned the faintest smile. "Sometimes truth hides best where no one looks," he said. "No one notices the man who cleans the floors." They talk in front of him. They forget he exists. It's the perfect cover. Victoria tilted her head, curious. "You risked your cover tonight," she said softly. "You could have lost your investigation, your job, everything. For my daughter." Daniel turned toward her then, the rain tracing slow paths down his face. His expression softened, something human and raw breaking through the professional calm. "Not for your daughter," he said. "For mine." She blinked, caught off guard. "When I saw Ava crying on that floor," he continued, "I didn't see her. I saw Emily. Small hands, scared eyes, trusting whoever reached out first. I couldn't let another father's promise be broken, even if it wasn't mine to keep." Victoria's throat tightened. "You said you couldn't save her," she whispered. "I couldn't," he said, "but maybe I can still honor her." The rain deepened for a moment, the drops heavier, more deliberate, like the world itself was listening. Victoria reached out instinctively, her hand brushing his sleeve. "You did," she said. "You did save someone tonight." Daniel glanced down at her hand, then back toward the horizon, where the first faint light of dawn began to dilute the night. "Maybe," he said, "but I think she saved me first." For a long time they sat in silence, the kind that didn't need words. Two parents bound not by circumstance, but by loss, by guilt, by a fragile understanding of what it meant to love someone you could no longer protect. When the rain finally eased, Victoria stood. "You should come inside," she said softly. "You'll catch cold." Daniel gave a small, weary smile. "You can't catch what's already part of you." She didn't argue. She just nodded, lingered a moment longer, and then turned toward the door. Behind her, Daniel stayed where he was, staring out into the gray horizon. The rain had stopped, but the ground still glistened, and for the first time in years, he let himself whisper her name into the morning. Emily. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a promise kept. Days bled together after the arrest, each one dragging behind the next like a wounded animal. The news cycle refused to let go. Headlines screamed her name in bold, merciless fonts. Harrington heiress, complicit, charity queen or criminal's muse. Cameras lurked beyond the gates. Journalists shouted questions through the rain. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls she didn't answer. Investors demanding statements, board members drafting public apologies, old friends suddenly distant. Every ring felt like another thread snapping loose. By the fourth day, the house had fallen into uneasy quiet. Staff moved like ghosts, speaking in low voices. Ava hadn't slept through a single night since the gala. She woke crying, whispering about the red box, about bad dreams that felt too real. The once mighty Harrington mansion, its marble halls, its velvet drapes, now felt like a mausoleum dressed in wealth. Victoria paced those halls at night, unable to rest. Her reflection followed her from mirror to mirror, and she hated the woman she saw there, perfectly groomed but hollow, a portrait of control, cracking at the edges. The sound of her own heels against the marble echoed back at her, sharp and lonely. Then one night, as she passed the staircase landing, something strange cut through the silence. A faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, a melody. A lullaby carried through the corridor like a memory sneaking back home. She stopped. The notes were soft, uneven, almost fragile, as though the person playing them was afraid of breaking the silence entirely. Victoria followed the sound through the hallway, down past the gallery of portraits that no longer looked noble but judgmental, until she reached the ballroom. The lights were dim, only the chandelier above glowing faintly, its crystal arms catching the last flicker of the firelight. And there, seated at the grand piano, was Daniel. He looked smaller somehow in the vast room, his back to her, shoulders hunched slightly forward as his fingers drifted over the keys. The same piano that had once hidden Ethan's secrets now whispered something heartbreakingly pure. The melody was simple, a series of notes that rose and fell like breathing. It felt both like a prayer and a confession. She stood in the doorway for a long time, unsure if she should interrupt. Finally, her voice broke the hush. "What is that?" she asked quietly. Daniel didn't turn. "A song Emily used to love," he said. His tone was distant, but tender. It helped her sleep. Something in the way he said her name, Emily, made Victoria's chest tighten. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He gave a faint nod. She said it sounded like sunlight trying to find its way through the rain. Victoria stepped farther into the room, her bare feet silent against the polished floor. "Can you teach it to my daughter?" Daniel looked up then, his expression unreadable. His eyes were tired, rimmed red, but calm in a way that felt like safety. "If she wants to learn," he said softly. From the staircase behind them came a smaller voice, gentle but clear. "I do." Both of them turned. Ava stood on the steps in her pajamas, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her hair was a tangled halo, her eyes glassy from sleep, but curious. Victoria started toward her, but Ava was already moving, slow, deliberate steps down the stairs until she stood just a few feet from Daniel. He smiled faintly and slid aside on the bench. "Come on, then," he said. "There's room." Ava climbed up, her tiny legs dangling far from the floor. Daniel showed her where to place her hands, his voice low, patient. "See? It's just 3 notes to start, like saying hello." She pressed the keys carefully, the sound uneven but pure. Victoria stood behind them watching. For the first time in weeks, her daughter's face wasn't tight with fear. It was open, curious, alive. The small, hesitant tune filled the vast room with something the house hadn't felt in a long time, gentleness. When the last note faded, Daniel said, "You did good." Ava smiled shyly. "It's pretty," she whispered. "It doesn't sound sad anymore." Daniel glanced at Victoria. Maybe that's because she's giving it a new ending. Victoria's eyes stung. She hadn't realized she was crying until she felt the warmth against her cheek. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The music had done what words couldn't. It softened the ache, if only for a moment. That night, for the first time in days, Ava fell asleep without the lights on. And somewhere in the vast quiet of the Harrington estate, a melody once born from loss became something new, something that sounded a lot like hope. Morning came softly, the kind that doesn't announce itself with noise but with light. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows of the Harrington estate, scattering gold across the polished piano and dusting the room with warmth. The storm of the past week had left behind its quiet aftermath. No reporters, no phone calls, no flashing lights, just stillness. For the first time in days, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It was exhaling. Daniel sat at the piano bench, his shoulders relaxed for once. Beside him, Ava perched on a stack of pillows to reach the keys. Her small fingers hovered uncertainly above them, like butterflies afraid to land. "Go on," he said, nodding gently. "Remember what I told you." "The keys aren't glass. You can't break them." She frowned with mock seriousness and pressed a note. Then another. The melody stumbled out unevenly, hesitant, imperfect, human. Daniel listened without correcting her. "You don't have to play it right," he said softly. "You just have to play it honest." Ava's brow furrowed. "What's the difference?" "Right means other people approve," he said. "Honest means it sounds like you." She thought about that for a moment, her lips pursed in concentration, before nodding as if she understood something far bigger than she was supposed to. "Okay," she said, and tried again. From the doorway, Victoria watched quietly, a mug of coffee warming her hands. She hadn't planned to interrupt, but she couldn't look away. The sound of the piano, off-key, uneven, and beautiful, filled the room like sunlight, creeping into a place that had been locked too long. Every wrong note made her smile. "She hasn't smiled in weeks," she murmured, almost to herself. Daniel didn't look up from the piano. "That's because you've been surviving," he said, "not living. Kids feel the difference." His words landed with an ease that felt almost unfair. Victoria took a slow sip of her coffee to steady herself. "You talk like someone who still believes in happy endings." He smiled faintly, eyes still on the keys. "No, I believe in second chances." Ava pressed another clumsy chord, and Daniel grinned. "There," he said. "Hear that?" "It sounds wrong," she said with a frown. "It sounds real," he corrected. "That's better." Victoria laughed softly, surprised by how natural it felt. "I don't think I've heard that sound in this house for a long time." "What sound?" Daniel asked, glancing over his shoulder. "Laughter," she said. "It's been quiet." "Quiet can be good," he said, gently closing the fallboard over the keys, "but not when it's empty." Ava looked between them, picking up on a tone she didn't fully understand but somehow recognized. "Can I play again later?" Daniel nodded. "As long as you promise not to quit when it sounds messy." She smiled proudly. "I never quit." "I know," he said, his voice softening. "That's your superpower." Victoria set her coffee down and walked toward them, the morning light catching in her hair. For a moment, she didn't look like the woman on the headlines or the heiress managing an empire. She just looked like a mother trying to find her footing again. She brushed her fingers gently through Ava's curls. "You did beautifully, sweetheart." "Mr. Daniel helped," Ava said, beaming. "He said music isn't supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to sound like how you feel." Victoria looked at Daniel. "That's a lesson adults forget." "Adults forget a lot," he said. "That's why kids remind us." Later that afternoon, while Daniel made calls from the study and Victoria sorted through endless emails she no longer cared about, Ava sat at the kitchen counter with a napkin and a handful of crayons. She drew in silence, tongue poking out in concentration. When she was done, she carried the napkin carefully to the living room where her mother sat. "Look," she said proudly, holding it out. Victoria took it, smiling before she even saw what it was. 3 stick figures, one with long hair, one with a shiny badge drawn in gold crayon, and one sitting at a piano. Above them was a crooked sun, its rays reaching in all directions. Beneath it, In big, uneven letters, Ava had written one word: home. Victoria's breath caught. She looked up at her daughter, who was already running off toward the piano again, humming her lullaby. Daniel appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. "She drew this," Victoria said, her voice soft. "Home." Daniel's gaze lingered on the napkin, and something unspoken passed between them, something fragile and new. "Looks about right," he said. The piano sang again, off-key and alive, filling the empty spaces the world had left behind. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a monument to what was lost. It felt like the beginning of something worth rebuilding. Days slipped into something almost ordinary, though the word didn't quite fit. Ordinary implied sameness, predictability, and nothing about this new life was either of those things. But there was peace in the routine that had quietly formed between them, the kind that didn't announce itself, but simply appeared one morning and never left. Daniel was no longer there as the agent assigned to protect her reputation or tie up the investigation's loose ends. He was there because the house, with all its echoing rooms and restless shadows, felt less like a home without him in it. He fixed leaky faucets, made sure Ava got to her piano lessons, and sometimes brewed coffee before she even woke up. He was steady, something rare in a life that had been defined by appearances that cracked too easily. Victoria, to her surprise, began to laugh again. The first time it happened, it startled her. She had spilled flour on herself trying to bake muffins for Ava's class, and Daniel had walked in just as she looked up, dusted white from chin to elbow. He raised an eyebrow. "You planning to open a bakery or summon ghosts?" he asked. She had laughed so suddenly it hurt her chest. Later, when Ava came home and pointed out that her mother's laugh sounded real now, Victoria didn't correct her. But there were moments, too, quieter ones, when she would catch herself in thought. The mornings were the worst, when the house was still and the noise in her head was louder than the world outside. One morning, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of her bedroom, warm and golden, catching the edges of the mirror across the room. She approached it without thinking, coffee in hand, and then stopped. The woman staring back at her wasn't the one from magazine covers or charity galas. Her hair was loose, falling in soft waves instead of the sculpted perfection she used to demand. There were faint lines under her eyes, traces of sleepless nights that no concealer could hide. But beneath the fatigue was something else, something startling. She looked alive. "I don't recognize this woman," she murmured to her reflection, half in awe, half in uncertainty. Daniel's voice came from behind her, calm and familiar. Maybe that's the point. She turned, catching his reflection over her shoulder. He stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, tie absent, holding a mug of coffee. The morning light softened the hard edges of his face. "You always know what to say," she said, her voice lighter than she felt. He smiled faintly, that quiet kind of smile that never quite reached both sides of his mouth. "Only because I already lost what mattered once, he said. His tone wasn't heavy. It was honest. "You still have a chance to keep it." Victoria followed his gaze to where Ava sat cross-legged on the rug, humming to herself as she drew in her sketchbook. She was coloring a piano again, 3 stick figures standing beside it, the sun spilling over all of them. Victoria's chest tightened. "She's changed," she whispered. "She's happy again." "So are you," Daniel said softly. She turned back to him, studying the man who had somehow walked into her life under the guise of an investigation and stayed like a quiet truth she hadn't realized she needed. "Do you ever stop being the hero?" she asked, the faintest teasing in her voice. Daniel chuckled. "Heroes are just people who refuse to stop showing up," he replied. "Most days that's all it takes." Victoria looked at him, really looked this time. Not as the man who'd saved her from ruin, not as the agent who'd uncovered a monster, but as someone who carried his own broken edges with grace. Someone she wanted to see healed. Her smile softened. "Then maybe it's my turn to show up," she said quietly. He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes did. something gentle, unspoken, and alive with possibility. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The sound of Ava's humming filled the space between them, warm and innocent. Victoria reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear, still watching him through the mirror. And when she turned around, Daniel was still there, not as the man who'd once brought her truth, but as someone who, somehow, had brought her back to herself. It wasn't love yet. But it was something that felt close, something fragile, something worth protecting. And for the first time, Victoria realized she wasn't afraid of what came next. Peace had a way of making people forget the sound of doors slamming, of sirens in the distance, of lies unraveling. For a while, that's what the Harrington estate had felt like, quiet, almost healed. The reporters had found new stories, the gossip had moved on, and the world outside had finally stopped staring. Inside, life became something simpler. Mornings with piano lessons, evenings filled with laughter that sounded real this time. Daniel stayed longer than anyone had planned, though no one said it out loud. He had become part of the rhythm of the house, steady as the ticking clock in the hall. But peace is fragile, and it never stays unbroken for long. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, no return address. No markings but a crimson wax seal pressed with an unfamiliar insignia, a serpent coiled around a key, the kind of detail that felt deliberate, designed to be noticed. Daniel found it in the mail pile, its texture wrong among the ordinary. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood by the window, turning it over in his hands while sunlight bled through the paper. Victoria entered a few minutes later, a notebook tucked under her arm, her hair still damp from the morning rain. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, half teasing. Daniel didn't answer. He broke the seal. The crack of wax splitting filled the silence. His eyes moved quickly across the page, once, twice. Then he stopped reading. His jaw tightened. "What is it?" Victoria asked. He folded the letter slowly, too carefully, the way someone does when trying to control their own shaking hands. "Nothing," he said at first. She frowned. "Daniel." He met her eyes then. The calm she knew in him, the kind that made chaos manageable, was gone. Replaced by something darker. "The man who hit my daughter's car," he said quietly. His name just came up again. Victoria blinked. The words didn't land right at first, like her mind refused to process them. "What do you mean, came up?" Daniel's voice was low, steady, but his expression betrayed him. "Your charity records. The archived ledgers, the ones before Ethan came in." She felt her stomach twist. "You mean—" He nodded grimly. "Ethan wasn't alone. Someone helped him. Someone who had access to the accounts years before you realized what he was doing." The air in the room thickened, every breath heavier. "Who?" she whispered. Daniel hesitated, his jaw tightening until the muscle in it twitched. "Someone close," he said. "Maybe even someone in your family." The word family hit like a blade. Victoria shook her head slowly, instinctively. "That's not possible. My family, whatever they were, they would never—" But even as she said it, her voice faltered. Because hadn't she said that once before? About Ethan. About her father's friends who'd turned their silence into currency. Daniel laid the folded letter on the piano lid. The paper looked small against the black wood, fragile but poisonous. "The sender didn't sign it," he said. "But whoever wrote it knew details no one outside the Bureau should. License plate fragments, the exact date, the file number from the police report that disappeared years ago." Victoria's hands trembled. "You think this is real?" He looked at her, eyes shadowed. "I think the past never stays buried if it still owes you a debt." From the next room came the faint sound of music, Ava at the piano, playing the lullaby Daniel had taught her, off-key, gentle, full of small mistakes. It drifted through the air like a reminder of everything they'd built, everything that could be lost. Victoria's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. "You think my father," she whispered, "could have been part of it?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence between them was its own confession. Outside, the rain started again, soft at first, then harder, hitting the windows in relentless rhythm. Daniel turned toward the sound, jaw clenched, voice low. "Whoever helped Ethan isn't done hiding," he said. "This letter isn't a warning, it's an invitation." Victoria felt the familiar weight of fear return, settling cold and heavy in her chest. In the next room, Ava kept humming, unaware of the storm slowly gathering its strength again, unaware that the past had just found its way back to their doorstep. And for the first time in months, the house didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a target. The letter had cracked something open inside Daniel that he'd spent years trying to seal shut. He sat at the small desk in the guest room, the one that overlooked the gardens, a single lamp cutting through the dark. Files were spread across the surface, old ones, worn soft from time and grief. Emily's case file lay at the center, the corners bent, the ink faded from years of handling. He had sworn he'd stop reopening it, that he'd stop punishing himself with what-ifs and dead ends. But now, with the letter in hand, everything was alive again. He flipped through the pages like a man retracing old wounds. The photos, the accident report, tire marks on asphalt, a fragment of a license plate, Q47-6. It had never meant anything before. But the letter had included a missing piece, a single page with a typed list of shell companies tied to Ethan Carrington's accounts. One of them, R.H. Holdings, bore that same fragment in its vehicle registry. R.H. Daniel stared at the initials, the letters blurring for a moment before coming into focus. He already knew what they meant. Still, he pulled the records to confirm, and there it was, in black and white, the name that twisted the air in his lungs, Richard Harrington. He said it aloud, almost disbelieving, Victoria's father, the man whose portrait hung in the grand staircase, who had funded hospitals, who'd been called a saint by the papers, dead for 3 years, celebrated in every obituary as the model of integrity. But behind the honors, behind the gold plaques and charity galas, he had been the architect of Ethan's network, the shell companies, the laundering, the hush money. It all traced back to him. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, jaw clenched. He wanted to feel relief at finally knowing the truth, but instead it felt like betrayal, layered on top of loss. The man responsible for his daughter's death wasn't a faceless stranger. He had been sitting in the photos of Victoria's family all along. When Victoria found him, he was still at the desk, eyes hollow. "You've been up all night," she said softly. He didn't answer right away. He closed the file slowly, his hands trembling just slightly. "I found something," he said. Her smile faltered. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. Then he turned the folder toward her, the name at the top of the page impossible to miss. She frowned. "That's my father's?" "Yes?" His voice was steady, but his eyes carried weight. "The man who hit my daughter's car. The one who killed her," he swallowed. It was him. The words hit her like a blow. She staggered back a step, gripping the edge of the doorframe. "My father?" she whispered. He couldn't have... Daniel's tone was quiet but unflinching. The car was registered under his alias. He paid the police to bury the file. He made it disappear. Victoria shook her head slowly, refusing the truth like it was poison. "No, you're wrong. My father, he wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a criminal. He dash. Daniel's voice cracked just slightly. "He killed my little girl." She pressed her hand to her mouth, the air leaving her lungs. "You came here for him," she said finally, realization dawning through the haze. Daniel's silence was the only answer. Her eyes filled, tears trembling but not falling. "You used me." He met her gaze. "No," he said softly. "I found you. There's a difference." She laughed then, a sound that wasn't laughter at all, sharp and broken. "You think that makes it better? You infiltrated my home, my life, my family. I didn't plan to, he said quietly. But once I saw the connection, I couldn't walk away." Her hands were trembling now. "You should have told me." "I tried," he said. "But every time I looked at you, I saw the one person who could make me believe in something again. And I was afraid I'd lose that if you knew." Her breath hitched. "You already have." Daniel stood slowly, his badge glinting faintly in the lamplight. For the first time, he didn't try to explain further. Some truths didn't need defending, they just stood there, raw and terrible, daring you to survive them. "Victoria," he began, but she cut him off. "Get out," she said, her voice low and shaking. "Just go." He hesitated, the words hanging heavy between them. Then he picked up his coat, his file, and walked past her toward the hall. Her voice followed him, not angry this time, just broken. "You came here to destroy a ghost," she said, "and you killed what was left of the living." When the door closed behind him, the silence didn't just fill the house, it consumed it. Upstairs, Ava's soft humming drifted through the walls, the same lullaby Daniel had taught her. It sounded fragile now, like it was holding back tears of its own. Days folded into each other, colorless and heavy. The once lively hum of the Harrington estate dulled into a silence that stretched from morning until long after midnight. Daniel was gone. No goodbye, no trace, just absence. The kind of absence that made the house feel too big and too quiet. Victoria filled the emptiness the only way she knew how, by working. Damage control became her new routine. Press statements written and rewritten, lawyers briefed, board members appeased. She smiled on camera and apologized to donors she no longer cared about. Every word was measured, rehearsed, hollow. The world applauded her resilience, but behind every headline about her strength was a truth no one saw. She was breaking in places that no amount of reputation management could fix. At night, the house betrayed her. The quiet didn't soothe, it accused. The ticking clock sounded too loud. The faint wind against the windows whispered his name like a memory that refused to stay buried. Ava asked about him constantly. "Where's Mr. Cole?" she would say, eyes wide and curious the way only a child's could be. "He was supposed to teach me the next song." Victoria would force a smile she didn't feel. "He had to go," she'd say softly. But Ava always followed with the same question, "When is he coming back?" And every time the words got harder to answer. Eventually she stopped trying. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered through the hallways, barefoot. The moonlight poured in through the high windows, painting the marble floor silver. She stopped in front of a door she hadn't opened in years, her father's old study. The smell hit her immediately when she turned the handle, faint cedar, dust, and the ghost of cigar smoke that time hadn't quite erased. The room was frozen in the moment he'd left it. Papers stacked neatly, pens aligned with mathematical precision, a half-empty decanter of scotch still on the shelf. His leather chair stood perfectly centered behind the desk, facing the window like a throne awaiting judgment. She sat in it, hesitantly at first, tracing her fingers over the grain of the wood. For so long, this room had been off-limits, sacred, the seat of a man she had worshipped as infallible. But now, all she saw was what he'd left behind: control, secrecy, and the faint echo of a truth he'd buried deep. Something in her told her to look deeper. She opened the desk drawers one by one, old ledgers, financial statements, personal letters, all arranged with the precision of a man who trusted order more than people. But when she reached the bottom drawer, her hand brushed against something coated in dust. An old folder, thick, labeled in her father's handwriting, "Cole, Emily." Her breath caught. The edges were brittle, the paper yellowed with time. Inside was a single check, dated years ago, made out to Daniel Cole. The amount, significant, almost obscene. But it wasn't the number that stopped her heart. It was the note scrawled beneath it, in the shaky handwriting of a man trying to make peace with the unthinkable. "For what my choices stole from you," her hands trembled. The room swayed. She dropped to her knees before the desk, the file clutched against her chest. Her father had known. He'd known he was responsible. The accident, the cover-up, the guilt. And he'd chosen silence over truth. Daniel hadn't lied. Her father had. Tears came hot and fast, not from anger, but from shame. The kind that burns because you were too blind to see what was right in front of you. She thought about Daniel's face when he'd told her the truth, how calm he had been, how much it had cost him to say the words. She'd driven him away for it. Her fingers brushed the ink of the note again, the words smearing slightly under the wetness of her tears. For what my choices stole from you. Victoria rose slowly, her knees weak, her throat raw. The check slipped from her hand, fluttering to the floor. She pressed her palm against the desk, steadying herself, and whispered to the empty room, "You were supposed to be better than this." The silence gave no answer. Somewhere down the hall, Ava stirred in her sleep, humming faintly, a soft, broken version of the lullaby Daniel had taught her. The sound pierced through the quiet like forgiveness she hadn't earned. Victoria turned off the light, leaving the study in darkness. Her father's truth sat heavy in her hands, and the realization heavier still. She had spent her life protecting a legacy built on lies, and in doing so she'd driven away the only man who had ever told her the truth. Rain had a way of remembering. It came back like old guilt, falling harder the longer it was ignored. The city was drowning in it that night, streets slick, headlights smeared into ribbons of gold and red. Victoria drove through it without seeing much of anything, her hands locked around the steering wheel, the wipers beating a steady rhythm against her pulse. She didn't know where she was going until she saw him. Daniel sat on a park bench just beyond the curve of the streetlight's glow, his coat soaked through, hair plastered against his forehead. The rain had already swallowed most of him, like the night was trying to take him back. He didn't look up when her car pulled over, didn't flinch when the door slammed shut. She stepped out without an umbrella. The rain bit at her skin, cold and insistent, but she didn't care. She crossed the street, her shoes splashing through puddles, until she was standing in front of him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You were right," she said finally, her voice catching between breaths. Daniel didn't move. His eyes stayed on the ground, the rain dripping from his lashes. "I didn't want to be," he replied. She stood there another moment before sitting beside him, the cold metal of the bench pressing through her soaked clothes. "You could have hated me," she said quietly. He turned his head then, his expression unreadable, but his voice soft. "I never hated you. I hated how much pain looks like love when you don't know better." Victoria's breath hitched. The rain fell harder, the kind of downpour that made everything blur, the trees, the lights, the memories. "I found the letter," she said. "My father's apology. The check. Everything." His jaw tightened, the muscle twitching once before his eyes flicked away. "Too late for both of them," he said. She looked at him then, really looked. His hands were clasped together, knuckles pale, like he was holding something fragile inside him that he couldn't let go. "Maybe," she said, "but not for us." He exhaled, a slow, tired sound. "Victoria dash, dash." She cut him off gently. "You spent years chasing justice for a ghost. I spent years pretending mine were saints. We're both guilty of worshiping the wrong dead." That made him glance up just slightly. She smiled, though it trembled at the edges. "But I don't want to spend the rest of my life making peace with the past. I want to learn how to build something new, even if it's cracked." For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel met her eyes. Rain pooled between them on the bench, but neither moved to shield themselves. "You really think we can do that?" he asked, voice low. She reached for his hand, hesitant at first. "I think we can try." He didn't pull away. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that said more than words could. Around them, the park blurred into watercolor, the rain washing away everything except the two of them and the quiet sound of something beginning again. "I used to come here after Emily died," Daniel said finally, his voice barely audible. This was where she learned to ride her bike. She fell once, scraped her knees, cried for 10 seconds, then laughed about it. Said she liked the scar, said it proved she tried. Victoria squeezed his hand. Then maybe we're both a little scarred too. He gave a small, broken laugh. You always find the right words when I least expect it. She smiled softly. Maybe it's because I finally stopped lying to myself. The rain eased to a drizzle, the street lights flickering against the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, low and distant, like a heartbeat calming down. Daniel looked down at their joined hands, then back at her. If I stay, he said, it can't be because you need saving. She nodded. Then stay because you want to. For the first time since she'd met him, he didn't have a reply ready. Instead, he leaned back on the bench, eyes lifting toward the dark, clouded sky. The rain tapped lightly against his face, and when he spoke, it was barely above a whisper. Then I'll stay. Victoria rested her head against his shoulder, her tears indistinguishable from the rain. Around them, the city shimmered in reflection, and for a moment, the past didn't matter. It was still there, yes, but so was the bridge they'd finally built across it. Weeks passed, quiet but full. The world outside the estate moved on. The news cycle found new tragedies to devour, and Victoria's name slowly faded from the headlines. Inside, life found a rhythm again. Ava practiced her piano pieces every morning, her small fingers growing surer, her laughter filling the house like a song that had been missing from it for years. Daniel stayed longer than he'd planned, though neither of them said it out loud. He fixed squeaky doors, helped Ava with her drawings, and sometimes joined Victoria on the porch at night when the house had gone still. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was easy, familiar, almost home. Then, one afternoon, the Bureau called. The offer was everything a man like Daniel should have wanted. Director of Behavioral Crimes, Washington, D.C. branch. Prestige. Authority. A badge with more weight than he'd ever carried. They told him it was a reward for years of dedication, for cases that had defined careers. They said it was time he led instead of chased. He should have felt something. Pride, maybe. Vindication. But when he held the new badge in his hand, the metal felt colder than it used to. It didn't hum with purpose anymore. It just sat there, heavy and still, like a memory that had outlived its meaning. Victoria found him that evening in the old guest room he'd been using, a half-packed duffel bag sitting open on the bed. His clothes were folded with military precision, his few belongings neatly stacked, efficient, detached, the way men pack when they don't plan to come back. "You're leaving," she said. He didn't turn at first. "That's what I do," he replied quietly. "I move on." Her hand tightened around the doorframe. "Maybe it's time to stop running." That made him look up. His eyes were tired but clear, the kind that had seen too much and still refused to look away. "Running?" he asked softly. "Is that what this looks like to you?" She stepped farther into the room. "You're chasing ghosts, Daniel." "You always have been. You think if you stay in motion, they can't catch you, but they already have." He exhaled, his shoulders stiffening. "You don't know what it's like," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I do," she said, "because I spent half my life pretending that if I kept moving, I wouldn't have to face what I'd lost. My father's lies, my own blindness. But standing still, staying, it's the only way I started to heal." He looked down, his hand brushing over the badge on the dresser. The light from the window caught its edge, gleaming for a moment before fading again. "This used to mean something," he murmured. "It was purpose, direction, justice." "And now?" she asked. He hesitated. "Now it feels like distance." A small sound came from the hallway, soft, familiar. They both turned. Ava stood there, barefoot and half asleep, her sketchbook clutched tightly against her chest. She blinked at him with sleepy eyes. "You're not going again, are you?" she whispered. Daniel froze. The question was innocent, but it hit him harder than anything the Bureau had ever said. He crouched down so they were eye level. "I was thinking about it," he said. Ava frowned. "But you belong here." He smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Do I?" She nodded, serious in that way only children can be. "You help Mom smile again. And you make the house quiet in the good way." Then she yawned, rubbing her eyes. "If you leave, it'll be too big again." Victoria's voice was soft behind him. "She's right, you know." He looked at her, at the woman who had once been a headline and was now just human. Tired, strong, flawed, real. "You think I belong here?" She smiled faintly. "I think you already do." For a long moment Daniel said nothing. Then he stood, picked up the badge from the dresser, and turned it over in his hand. The rain outside had begun again, tapping gently against the glass. "Maybe justice isn't a title," he said finally. "Maybe it's a choice." Victoria nodded, her eyes soft. "Then make one." He looked down at the badge once more, the symbol of everything he thought he was, and then crossed the room. Without ceremony, he set it on the piano in the hallway, the same piano that had once hidden crimes and later healed them. The metal gleamed faintly in the dim light before settling into stillness. When he turned back to her, he wasn't an agent anymore. He was just Daniel. And for the first time in years, that was enough. Months had a way of softening sharp edges. What had once been a house built to impress was now a place meant to heal. The Harrington estate, stripped of its chandeliers and velvet curtains, reopened under a new name, the Cole Foundation for Child Safety and Advocacy. The marble floors remained, but now they carried the footsteps of children and volunteers instead of politicians and donors. The echoes were different too, no longer empty, no longer rehearsed. They sounded like laughter, like belonging. Victoria sold her shares in the company her father had built, the same empire that had taught her to measure her worth in numbers. She downsized, letting go of the glitter that had once anchored her image. What she kept was purpose, messy, unpolished, but real. It was strange at first to live a life without power meetings and perfectly crafted statements. But each day, as the foundation grew, she realized that simplicity didn't mean loss. It meant freedom. Daniel, who had once lived inside the quiet armor of duty, poured himself into the work. He trained volunteers, taught self-defense classes, and lectured at schools about recognizing warning signs of abuse and neglect. He spoke about vigilance, but more than that, he spoke about compassion. People listened, not because he wore a badge, he'd left that behind, but because he spoke from the kind of truth that can't be taught, only survived. The plaque on the front door read, "In memory of Emily Cole." But inside those walls, the name became something more than grief. It became a promise. Ava became the heartbeat of the place. She insisted that the gray hallways needed color, that children shouldn't have to heal in rooms that looked like waiting areas. So she painted, first the entryway, then the walls near the classrooms, then the stairwell where sunlight poured in from the skylight above. Her small hands moved with focus and joy, each brushstroke carrying a kind of wisdom only children understand. Bright blues, warm yellows, deep reds. One afternoon, Daniel stopped beside her while she was working on a mural near the main corridor. The image was simple but full of life. A cluster of hands reaching toward a sunrise, each hand a different shade, each one outlined in the colors she had chosen. "You've been busy," he said, smiling as he leaned against the wall. "Why all three colors?" Ava paused, looking up at him with paint on her cheek and a seriousness far beyond her years. "Blue for safe," she said confidently, "yellow for hope, and red for brave." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, the kind of ache that isn't pain but recognition. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. From the doorway, Victoria watched them, arms folded loosely, a faint smile curving her lips. She looked at her daughter, then at Daniel, and something inside her settled, The kind of peace that comes when you realize the world has started to heal in ways you never thought it could. "She's learned more from you than any teacher ever could," she said softly. Daniel turned toward her, his gaze warm but steady. "No," he said. She learned from watching her mother finally listen. The words hit her gently, like light through stained glass, broken into colors, each one more beautiful because of the cracks. For so long she had lived in a world where listening meant weakness, where silence was dangerous. But now she understood. Silence could also make room for truth, for love, for change. Later that evening, as the last group of volunteers left and the lights dimmed in the hallways, Victoria walked through the building slowly. She traced her fingers along the walls Ava had painted, the textures rough and alive. In one corner she found a small inscription, written in uneven handwriting. "Home isn't where you're safe, it's where you're seen." She smiled through the sting of tears. When she found Daniel in the courtyard, he was sitting on one of the benches, watching the sunset fade into gold and rose. "It's beautiful," she said, nodding toward the building. He glanced at her, then at the glowing windows reflecting Ava's colors. "It's honest," he replied. She sat beside him, shoulders brushing, and for a long while they just watched the light change together. Somewhere inside, a child's laughter carried through the open door, a sound bright enough to remind them both why they'd built all this. The Cole Foundation didn't erase the past. It transformed it. And in that transformation, they found something neither of them had dared to hope for again: peace, born not from perfection, but from purpose. The evening was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything. Outside, the sky glowed in that soft hour between sunset and night, where the light turns gold before fading into blue. The old piano sat near the open window, catching what little daylight was left. Its surface was scratched, its edges worn, but its sound still carried something pure. Daniel sat on the bench, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to his elbows, his hands resting loosely on the keys. Beside him, Victoria leaned against the edge, her bare feet brushing the floor, her hair loose and wild, in a way she never used to allow. They didn't talk much anymore when they were together. They didn't have to. The silence between them had become comfortable, soft around the edges. He pressed a few keys, aimless at first, notes that drifted like thoughts left unsaid. She smiled faintly. "You ever get tired of fixing broken things?" she asked, her tone playful, but with that undercurrent of truth she couldn't quite hide. He looked up at her, a small smirk tugging at his mouth. "Only when I realized they were never broken to begin with," he said. Victoria chuckled under her breath. "That sounds like something you'd tell one of your volunteers." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's something I had to learn the hard way." The sound of the piano filled the space again, low and steady. The melody wasn't rehearsed. It was something he was finding in real time. She watched his fingers move, steady, deliberate, like they were remembering how to feel instead of how to perform. When he stopped, the quiet that followed was heavy, but not empty. He reached into his pocket then, his movement slow, almost hesitant. "I was going to wait," he murmured, "but I've learned that waiting has a bad habit of stealing moments." Her brows lifted slightly, curious. "What are you doing, Daniel?" He pulled out a small box, not the kind that sparkled or announced itself with grandeur, just a simple wooden one, the lid slightly worn smooth from being handled too often. He turned it over in his hands before opening it and held it out toward her. Inside wasn't a ring, it was a locket, silver, delicate, slightly tarnished around the edges. Victoria blinked, caught off guard. He opened it carefully, revealing one side that held a small, faded photo of a little girl with bright eyes and a crooked smile. Emily. The other side was blank. "I thought maybe," he said, his voice low but steady, "it's time she had company." For a moment she couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, her breath catching in that space between grief and something too big to name. "Daniel," she whispered. He smiled softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't need forever," he said. "Just a chance to start again. With you, with her memory, with whatever this is." She reached for the locket, her hands trembling as she traced her fingers over the tiny photo. "You're sure?" she asked. "You've already given so much of yourself. You don't have to—" "I'm not giving anything up," he interrupted gently. "I'm finally finding what I lost. Or maybe I'm just realizing it was never gone." Tears blurred her vision. Before she could stop them, he reached out, brushing one away with the pad of his thumb. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered. But she did. Her voice shook, but the smile that came with it was warm, unguarded. "Then let's start with tonight." He exhaled, relief and emotion threading through the sound. She leaned closer, their foreheads touching lightly, the piano between them like a witness to something too fragile for words. They didn't kiss right away. They just stayed there, in that stillness, her hand resting on his chest, his fingers still ghosting over the keys. The world outside dimmed into starlight, and the first faint hum of night drifted through the open window. When she finally whispered, "Play something," he did. The notes were soft, full of pauses, but this time he wasn't playing alone. Her hand found his on the piano, pressing a key beside his, imperfect but honest. The melody grew, slow and hopeful. And when she looked at him again, she wasn't seeing the man who had once come into her life as an interruption. She was seeing the one who had stayed, quietly building something that finally felt like home. It wasn't grand, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for them, that was enough. The chandeliers burned softly this time, warm gold instead of icy white. The same ballroom that had once been a stage for pride and deceit was alive again, but with a different kind of light. A year had passed, and the ghosts of that night still lingered in the corners, but they no longer haunted the room. They stood witness to its transformation. The marble floors shone not for vanity, but for purpose. Instead of diamond necklaces and polished smiles, the guests wore ribbons, name tags, and quiet gratitude. It was the Cole Foundation's first annual benefit, a night meant not to impress but to remember. No paparazzi waited by the doors, no flashbulbs shattered the mood. The only cameras were held by parents capturing small victories. A child laughing, a survivor sharing her story, a man with his arm around the daughter he once almost lost. At the front of the room, the stage had been transformed. The grand piano sat in its usual place, its polished surface gleaming under soft amber light. Behind it, the foundation's motto was etched in gold: "Every child seen, every voice heard." Victoria stood at the podium, her posture composed, but her eyes bright with something deeper than confidence. Ava stood beside her, wearing a blue ribbon around her wrist, her sketchbook tucked under one arm. Daniel watched from the crowd, one hand resting against his chest, as if trying to keep the moment from escaping too soon. When the murmurs faded and the lights dimmed, Victoria began. Her voice carried easily through the hall, not practiced this time, not polished, just true. "A year ago," she said, glancing around the room, "this hall held secrets." The audience stilled. It held lies and pride and silence. It was a place that looked beautiful, but hid too much pain beneath the polish. She paused, her gaze finding the far wall, where the old red piano box had once stood. The memory flickered through her daughter's voice, Daniel's calm steadiness, the truth that had cracked everything open. "But tonight," she continued, her tone softening, "it holds stories, real ones, of courage, of loss, and of love that refused to give up." Applause rose gently, respectful, like a tide that lifted the room. Victoria smiled, waiting until it faded before continuing. "This foundation was born from pain, but it lives for healing. Every child here tonight represents a story that didn't end in silence. Every parent, every survivor, every volunteer, You are proof that even broken beginnings can lead to something beautiful." Ava nudged her mother's arm gently, whispering something that made Victoria's lips curve into a small laugh. "And," Victoria added, "I owe thanks to two people who taught me that truth isn't something you find once, it's something you keep choosing." She gestured toward the piano, where Daniel now stood, caught slightly off guard. "To the man who showed me that justice isn't loud, it's patient. That healing doesn't happen in courtrooms or headlines, but in the quiet moments when you decide to stay." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Daniel didn't move at first. He stayed where he was, eyes glistening under the soft light, every cheer echoing like forgiveness he never expected to hear. Victoria continued, her voice trembling just enough to show it was real. "And to my daughter," she said, turning to Ava, "who taught me that bravery doesn't always sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like a song played just for you." Ava grinned shyly and reached for her mother's hand. "Your turn," she whispered. Victoria nodded and gestured toward the piano. Daniel hesitated, then walked forward slowly. The crowd fell into silence. He sat at the bench, running his fingers lightly over the keys, the ghosts of the past night still lingering there. But this time, they felt like old friends. He began to play. The same melody that had once filled this room in defiance now rose again, softer, steadier. The notes carried through the hall, and for a moment it was as if the building itself was breathing again. Victoria and Ava stood together, their hands intertwined, while Daniel played the final chord. The sound lingered, a heartbeat suspended in the air before dissolving into applause. When it ended, Daniel looked up. His eyes found Victoria's, then Ava's, and for the first time in years, he let himself feel it fully. Peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from finally being seen and finally belonging. He smiled, and for once the past didn't follow him. It simply bowed its head and let him go. The ballroom had emptied into silence, the kind that only comes after something sacred. The applause had long faded, the chairs stacked neatly along the walls, and the chandeliers now glowed dimly, as if exhaling after a long night. What had once been a place of spectacle and scandal now felt holy in its quiet. Only 3 people remained: Daniel, Victoria, and Ava. The echoes of laughter and gratitude still lingered faintly in the air, but the hall itself seemed to sigh with relief, like it finally understood its purpose. Daniel stood near the piano, his jacket folded over the bench, sleeves rolled to his elbows. The piano sat in the same place it always had, but it looked different now, not as a symbol of wealth or vanity, but of something tender and earned. Victoria walked slowly across the floor toward him, her heels clicking softly against the marble. The last of the candles flickered along the tables, their flames mirrored in her eyes. "It's strange," she said, her voice low. "I used to think this room was about appearances. Now it feels like memory." Daniel smiled faintly. "Memories are better than masks." She stopped beside the piano, her gaze dropping to the keys. "Play it," she whispered. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. His fingers hovered above the keys, hesitant, reverent. Then the first note came, soft, unhurried, the same lullaby he had played that night when everything had begun to change. The sound drifted upward, mingling with the low hum of the lights. From the far side of the hall, Ava stirred. She had been drawing at one of the tables, half asleep against her sketchbook, but the music lifted her. She crossed the floor quietly and sat beside Daniel, small and sure, her presence as natural as breath. When the melody reached its center, she began to hum along, her voice delicate and steady. It was the same lullaby that had once belonged to grief, now reborn as something softer, something full of life. The notes swelled through the room, touching every corner that had once held secrets. The air felt warmer, as if even the walls were listening. Victoria stood behind them, her heart caught somewhere between the past and the moment unfolding before her. The sight of Daniel and Ava together, one playing, one humming, was enough to undo her. They weren't just making music. They were mending something invisible. When the last note faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. The kind of silence that holds gratitude, love, and the ghosts that finally rest easy. Victoria moved closer and sat beside Daniel on the bench. The warmth of him was grounding. She leaned her head gently on his shoulder, her voice a whisper against the quiet. "You think Emily hears us?" Daniel let out a slow breath, his eyes still on the keys. "I think," he said softly, "she never stopped listening." Ava looked up at them, her eyes reflecting the dim glow of the lights. "Then maybe she's singing too." He smiled, a real one this time, the kind that reaches the eyes. "Yeah," he said, "maybe she is." Outside, the night air pressed softly against the tall glass windows. The city beyond was quiet, its noise dampened by the rain that had started to fall again. Each droplet caught the streetlight, turning to gold before disappearing into the pavement. The wind carried faint traces of the melody out into the night, into the trees, into the world. They sat there for a long time, not speaking, not moving. Ava's head rested against Daniel's arm, her sketchbook now closed on her lap. Victoria's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the piano, her eyes half closed, the music still echoing inside her. For once there was nothing to fix, nothing to hide, nothing to prove. Just the sound of hearts finally beating in the same rhythm. And when Daniel finally rose, closing the piano lid with a gentle hand, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a continuation of a story that had found its peace, of lives that had finally learned how to listen. Outside, the night carried the last note upward, high above the city and into the stars. Somewhere, it seemed, the universe paused just long enough to hear it. A janitor turned agent, a heiress turned mother, and a little girl who believed in color. Together, they had rewritten what love could sound like, and this time, the world was listening. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs a little hope tonight. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And if you believe that love, healing, and second chances still exist, don't forget to hit subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that even the quietest lives can create the loudest symphonies.